I bought the cabin at an auction after it sat vacant for a few years. It was cheap, a little too cheap, but I figured it was just because of the condition. From the outside, it didn't look like much. Peeling brown paint, sagging porch, broken windows. The property had a half-acre of land surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The listing said it had potential for a hunting retreat or a small vacation spot, and I figured if I fixed it up right, I could rent it out or maybe flip it. The first time I drove up there, it was dead quiet. No traffic, no neighbors in sight, just the hum of bugs and the wind moving through the pines. The cabin smelled like rot and old wood. The roof leaked, the floorboards were soft in places, and mice had made a home in the kitchen cabinets. I didn't plan to stay overnight, just do day trips for the renovations. I brought tools, work gloves, and food in a cooler, and every morning I'd show up early and work until dark. One afternoon, a couple of weeks into the project, I decided to get under the cabin to check out the insulation and see if there were any major structural issues. There was a small opening around the back where the skirting had broken away, and I had to lie flat and wiggle in on my stomach. The space under there was tight, only about 2 feet high. Damp dirt, spider webs, old boards with nails poking out, and clumps of yellow fiberglass everywhere. I had my flashlight with me and crawled in about 10 or 12 feet. That's when I saw something pushed up against one of the inner support beams. Something black and square, crusted over with mold and dust. It was a backpack. It looked like it had been there for a long time. I dragged it toward me, careful not to rip it apart since it was half rotted. When I opened it, I found a few things inside. A small, old-style flashlight, long dead. A couple of torn granola bar wrappers. And a notebook. The notebook was damp around the edges, and some of the ink had bled, but most of the pages were still legible. The handwriting was small and tight, covering nearly every inch of each page. I flipped through it slowly, squinting in the dim light. The entries were all dated, starting months apart at first, then becoming more frequent. They were short, single lines mostly. June 4th, knocking on the wall again. July 29th, found my window open this morning. October 12th to 3:21 a.m., footsteps again. It went on like that. Pages and pages of the same kind of thing. Times of night, creaking sounds, someone trying the door handle, breathing sounds outside the window. The tone of the writing got more frantic the further I read. The last page hit me hard. March 12th, I heard him come in. He's inside now.
I'm hiding.
That was it. No name. No signature, nothing after that. I lay there in the dirt for a second, frozen. My mind ran wild with thoughts. Who had written it? What happened to them? Why was the backpack shoved under the house? I backed out slowly, still clutching the moldy bag. I didn't know what to do at first. I put the notebook and the other stuff in a plastic bin in the back of my truck and drove down to the local sheriff's office. I told the deputy who met me at the desk that I found a backpack with a disturbing notebook in it. He asked for the address, took down my info, and looked through the pages. They said they'd look into it. A couple of days later, a detective called me. He told me they didn't find any reports of a missing person tied to the location, and there weren't any fingerprints or identifying info on the notebook or the backpack. No signs of foul play that they could prove. It might have just been someone squatting there before I bought the place, someone who got spooked or was mentally unstable. That didn't sit right with me. The way the writing changed over time, it didn't feel like rambling or fiction. It felt real. The last few pages, the writing was shaky, like the person was writing while they were panicking. That last line, I heard him come in, had a smear through it like the pen caught on something or the writer had jerked it across the paper in a rush. After that, I kept working on the place, but the way I thought about it changed. Every creak, every thump, every wind gust through the trees made me pause. I'd get there in the morning and walk the whole perimeter before starting anything. I checked every lock on every door and window multiple times a day, and I never stayed past sunset. The inside of the cabin started looking better. New paint, patched floors, new kitchen cabinets, but I never felt right in there. I'd be sanding drywall or hanging insulation and suddenly feel like someone was watching me from the hallway, or like something was just barely out of sight in the next room. The feeling would pass, but it was always there under the surface. I couldn't stop thinking about whoever had written that notebook. I went back under the cabin a couple more times to see if I missed anything, but there was nothing else there, just dirt, nails, and shadows. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after I'd found the backpack, I was up on a ladder painting the trim near the ceiling when I dropped my brush. It bounced down the stairs to the crawlspace hatch, the only entry to the area below the floor from inside. The hatch wasn't supposed to open easily. It was old and had been stuck shut the whole time. But as I reached the bottom step, I noticed it was open about an inch. I didn't remember opening it. I stood there for a long time just staring. Then I slowly nudged it closed with my foot, slid the deadbolt across it, and walked outside. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes before driving home. That was the last day I worked on the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there. Not a ghost, a real person. Someone who had maybe once crawled up through that same hatch. Someone who might have written in that notebook before disappearing for good. Maybe someone had been living in the woods, sneaking in at night. Or maybe whoever had been inside that night, March 12th, had never left. Maybe they were buried somewhere out there in the trees. I never spent a night in that cabin. Never brought a sleeping bag. Never so much as laid down on the new floors. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't do it. I didn't want to be there when the sun went down. I ended up putting the place back on the market about 3 months later. Took a loss. The buyer didn't ask many questions, and I didn't volunteer anything. I still think about that notebook, about how long it must have taken to write all those entries, about what the writer was feeling in those final moments. I wonder if they were ever found, or if they're still listed as missing somewhere under a different name, or maybe no one ever looked for them. Sometimes I regret not pushing harder with the sheriff's office, but I also know I didn't want to get more involved than I already was. I didn't want to know what might have happened under that floor, or in that hallway, or in the woods just beyond the porch. Some things you just walk away from, and you don't go back. I booked a remote cabin in the mountains for a week, hoping to get some writing done. I'd been in a rut for months, stuck between projects, deadlines piling up, and I needed somewhere quiet. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just me, my laptop, and the sound of trees swaying in the wind. The listing was cheap and didn't have many reviews, but the photos looked fine. It was an old wooden place with a small front porch, a wood-burning fireplace, and a propane stove. The owner's listing said there was no electricity but enough solar power to charge devices during the day. That suited me just fine. The drive up was long, winding through forest roads that got narrower the deeper I went. By the time I reached the place, it was just past dusk. The trees pressed in tight on both sides of the gravel driveway, and the only sound was the crunch of my tires on the stone. The cabin sat in a little clearing, weathered and dark, with a small stack of chopped wood beside the door. There was a metal mailbox nailed to the front post. Inside it, I found the key along with a handwritten note on lined paper folded in half. The note read, "Welcome. Please don't tamper with the freezer in the mudroom. It's broken and dangerous. Use the wood stove for heat. Propane is full. Water pump is in the back if it shuts off. Enjoy your stay." I didn't think much of the freezer comment at the time. I figured it was old and maybe leaked Freon or something. The mudroom was just a little extension off the back of the cabin. It had a dusty concrete floor and smelled like damp wood. The chest freezer was pushed into the corner, big and scratched, with a thick rusted chain looped around it and a heavy-duty padlock. It didn't have a cord plugged into anything. I assumed it had been there forever. A stack of firewood was piled beside it, and an old snow shovel leaned against the wall. I glanced at the freezer, shrugged, and went back inside. The inside of the cabin was as bare bones as advertised. A single room with a table, 2 chairs, a small bed with a thin mattress, and a desk near the window. The fireplace was built into the far wall with a blackened iron grate. A small shelf above it held a few dusty paperbacks and a candle lantern. I got a fire going, heated up some canned soup on the propane stove, and ate while the room warmed. It was quiet, almost too quiet, The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent most of the daylight hours writing at the desk or sitting on the porch with coffee. The woods were peaceful. I didn't see a single person, car, or even hear a plane overhead. Just birds during the day and frogs at night. On the third night, it got cold early. I went out to the mudroom to get more firewood around 9 p.m. As I stacked some logs in my arms, I heard something strange. A low hum. I paused. It was coming from the corner, the freezer. At first, I thought I imagined it. I leaned closer. The sound wasn't constant. It would pulse on for a few seconds, then fade. A strange mechanical hum, almost electrical, but the thing wasn't even plugged in. I walked around it, checked again. The cord was wrapped tightly around the back and zip-tied in a coil. I stared at it for a while but couldn't make sense of it. Maybe it was just the wind vibrating something metal nearby. I brushed it off and went back inside. But that hum came back later. Around midnight, I was lying in bed reading with the fire dying down when I heard it again, this time more persistent. I sat up. The room was completely still, and the sound seemed to come through the wall, like a soft engine idling. Then a loud clunk, a metallic knock. It sounded like it came from inside the freezer, not something hitting it from the outside, but from within. I stayed still for a long time, staring at the ceiling, heart racing. I told myself it was just the metal contracting from the cold, or a mouse or something had knocked something over. I didn't go out to check that night. I just lay there, eyes open in the dark, fire down to embers, ears straining for more. The next night, it got worse. I was up late again, trying to write, when I heard the hum start just after 2:30 a.m. This time, it didn't stop. It built slowly, rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Then came the clunk again, louder, heavier. It echoed through the floorboards. I put on my coat and boots and grabbed the flashlight. The cold hit me hard when I opened the inner door to the mudroom. The air in there felt heavier, not just colder, wrong somehow, like walking into a room where something bad had just happened. The flashlight beam landed on the freezer. The chain was still wrapped around it, the padlock still in place. But now there was a noise, not a hum anymore, scratching, soft at first, then harder, like something scraping the inside walls. Slow, deliberate, not frantic. I stood frozen, listening. My breath came in short clouds. The scratching stopped, then resumed again right near the lid, directly under the chain. I don't know how long I stood there, couldn't look away. I wanted to leave it alone. I wanted to turn around and go back to bed and pretend it wasn't happening. But I couldn't. My brain just wouldn't let go. Something was wrong. Couldn't ignore it. I turned and went outside to the back of the cabin where the tools were stored. There was an old crowbar leaning against the wall under the overhang. I grabbed it and went back in. I didn't hesitate. I wedged the crowbar into the side of the lock and yanked hard. It took 3 tries before the padlock snapped off. The chain clattered to the floor. The freezer lid creaked as I opened it. Inside were neat stacks of butcher paper-wrapped packages. Maybe 20, maybe 30 of them, tightly packed and frosted over. Each one was labeled in black marker. First names: Dale, Jessica, Tyler, Marie, Tom, Lena, on and on, all written in the same shaky cursive. Some of the packages were bigger than others, some small. None of them were dated. I didn't touch anything else. I didn't dig through it. I didn't want to see more than I already had. I closed the lid slowly. My hands were shaking. I pushed the chain back over it without locking it and walked back through the cabin. Grabbed my backpack, shoved my laptop and wallet into it, and walked out. I didn't even turn off the propane stove or check if the fire was out. I just got in my car and backed down the long gravel driveway in the dark, headlights bouncing off trees. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of a gas station near the highway, almost 2 hours later. The guy at the counter gave me a weird look as I stood there in the harsh fluorescent light, trying to catch my breath, my hands still trembling. I stayed in my car until sunrise. I didn't report it right away. I should have, but I couldn't think straight. I was scared I'd be asked why I broke into the freezer, scared they'd think I was the one who did something wrong. I drove back to the city and tried to forget about it. A week later, I finally called the sheriff's office in the county where the cabin was. I gave them the address and told them exactly what I saw. I never gave my name. That cabin's listing disappeared a few days after that. I never went back. My cousin's cabin sat near the edge of a quiet pine forest in northern Michigan. It wasn't fancy or big, just a 2-bedroom wooden structure with a tin roof and an old porch that creaked when you walked on it. He'd bought it years ago as a hunting getaway, but lately he hadn't had time to visit. He called me a few weeks before winter and asked if I could drive up there for a few days, fix a couple things before the snow came. I didn't mind. I had some time off and thought the quiet might be good for me. I got there late in the afternoon. The air smelled like dried leaves and the inside of the cabin was cold and musty. No heat had been on in weeks. I dropped my bag by the door, opened some windows to air it out, and started making a list of what needed fixing. A few shingles were loose on the roof, the screen door needed a new hinge, and the back steps were starting to rot. Basic stuff. I figured I could knock most of it out in 2 or 3 days. The first night was uneventful. I made some canned soup on the gas stove and read a paperback I found in a drawer. I was asleep by 10. The second day, I patched up the shingles, tightened the door, and brought in some firewood. Around mid-afternoon, I was walking down the hallway toward the bathroom when I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A thin pull cord hanging from the ceiling, just a few inches away from the light fixture. I don't know how I missed it the first day. It was covered in dust and blended in with the ceiling. I tugged it, and a square section of the ceiling dropped down, unfolding into one of those rickety wooden ladders. An attic. My cousin had never mentioned it. I figured it was just insulation space or old storage. Curiosity got the better of me, and I climbed up. The attic was cramped and low. I had to crouch just to move around. It smelled like old wood and mice. Dust coated everything. There wasn't much up there. A few cardboard boxes, an old coat draped over a broken chair, and in one corner, sitting on a wooden crate, was a small radio. It looked old, maybe from the 70s or 80s, with a cracked plastic dial and faded dials. It was plugged into an outlet that ran along one of the beams. The radio was on, barely, buzzing with a faint static. No music, no voice, just a low hum like background noise between stations. I stood there for a while, just listening to it. I thought it was strange to leave something like that plugged in, especially if no one had been up there in a long time. Maybe it had been left on years ago and no one noticed. I unplugged it, coiled the cord around it, and left it where it was. No need for it to be using power for no reason. That night, I built a fire and made some pasta. I stayed up later than the night before, just enjoying the quiet and the warmth of the cabin. Around midnight, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. A buzzing, not loud, but noticeable. Faint at first, then a little sharper, like a bad radio signal. At first, I thought maybe I was hearing things, or maybe there was an electrical issue in the walls. But then I realized it was coming from above, the attic. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and went into the hallway. The pull cord was back, hanging down like I hadn't touched it. But I knew I had pushed it back up earlier and closed the panel. Still, I pulled it again. The ladder dropped, same as before. I climbed up. The radio was plugged in again. Static louder this time. Still just noise, no voice, no music, just that harsh buzzing. But what made my stomach turn was the power cord. I had taken it down with me earlier. I remembered wrapping it around the radio. I didn't bring it back up. There was no second cord, no extension. The outlet was in the same place. The radio was just plugged in again, as if it had never been touched. I yanked the plug, picked up the radio, and took it down with me. I didn't want to be around it anymore. I carried it outside and put it in the bed of my truck under an old tarp. I didn't say anything out loud, but I was unnerved. I couldn't think of a good reason for how it had gotten plugged back in, especially when the only cord was now downstairs. I tried to sleep but kept waking up every hour. I felt like the cabin was listening. It was probably just in my head, but every small sound, the wind, the groan of the walls, the shifting of the roof, felt louder than it should have. I kept thinking about that attic, how quiet and stale the air had felt, how that radio kept buzzing like it was stuck between stations, trying to grab something. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I'd only been there 2 days, but I didn't care. I wasn't interested in fixing steps or checking pipes anymore. The place felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, like it had its own rhythm that didn't match the outside world, like something was looping inside the walls. Before I left, I went up into the attic one last time. I didn't really know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that the noise had stopped, that there was nothing there, but it was still buzzing. There was no radio anymore. I had taken it. The crate it sat on was empty, and still that low hum, vibrating faintly through the beams and insulation, like it was coming from the wiring, or deeper. I pressed my ear to the wall and felt it. A quiet vibration, steady, not loud, but constant. That was enough. I climbed down, shut the attic panel, and left it hanging. I didn't even bother closing it all the way. I grabbed my bag, started the truck, and drove. I didn't call my cousin until I was an hour out. I told him something was off in that place and he could hire someone else. I didn't explain everything, just said I wasn't comfortable being there alone, which was true. He didn't ask many questions, said he'd take care of it. I haven't been back since. I still think about that attic sometimes. The way the static seemed to be waiting for something, like the cabin itself was listening to its own signal. All I know is that radio's still in the back of my garage, and every once in a while I think I hear it buzzing. I had rented a remote cabin for a week to get away from work, from people, from everything. I'd been dealing with burnout for months, and after my doctor told me I needed to take a real break, I found this place online. It was buried deep in the forest, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and another 5 miles off a gravel road. The listing said no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no distractions. That was exactly what I wanted. I brought a couple coolers of food, a few books, and enough firewood and propane to last the whole trip. I wasn't expecting luxury, just peace. The cabin was older than it looked in the pictures. 1 floor, long and narrow, with a tiny porch out front. The roof sagged a little, and the wood siding was weathered gray. But it was clean inside. Simple layout, main room with a table and chairs, a small kitchen area, a single bedroom in the back, and a bathroom with a compost toilet and cold running water from a tank outside. There was a wood stove, some shelves with dusty paperbacks, and an old radio that only picked up static. The forest came right up to the back of the cabin. No neighbors in sight. The silence was thick. The first day went as planned. I unpacked, stacked the food, made sure the propane stove worked. I hiked around a bit, followed a deer trail down to a stream, sat on a mossy rock and listened to the water. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything but birds and wind and my own boots in the leaves. I slept early that night, warm in my sleeping bag, the wood stove crackling. The second day, I tried reading but kept getting distracted. My thoughts were loud without my phone or anything else to drown them out. I walked again, wandered deeper into the trees. I found a logging road and followed it for a while, but it faded off into brush. I headed back, slower this time, watching the trees. Something about them felt different. Maybe I was just getting used to the quiet, but every snapping twig made me turn. At one point, I thought I saw someone through the trees, a figure in a dark jacket, but when I blinked, they were gone. I told myself it was nothing, just a shadow, maybe a burned stump. Still, I walked faster after that. I kept looking back. The air felt colder even though the sun was still out. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside felt louder. I heard something scrape the side of the cabin. Then it was silent again. I waited, heart pounding, but it didn't come back. I didn't get out of bed. I didn't look. The wind picked up later, and I finally drifted off just before sunrise. The third day, I felt off, unsettled. I kept thinking about that shape I saw in the woods. I walked around the cabin and checked the walls. There were long, shallow marks on the backside, like something had dragged a stick or a knife across the wood. 5 lines like fingers or claws. I tried to convince myself it was a raccoon or a bear, something scraping for food, but it didn't sit right with me. It was too deliberate, too straight. I felt like I was being watched the whole time I stood out there. I stayed close to the cabin after that. Didn't hike, just read or tried to. The words blurred. I kept glancing at the windows. Every now and then I thought I heard footsteps in the leaves, crunching slowly, then stopping. I'd go quiet, hold my breath, then nothing. I'd step outside and find the woods still. No animals, no birds, no wind. Just quiet. That thick kind that presses in on your ears. That night, just after I turned off the lantern, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not fast, just soft, slow, like someone pacing in the leaves. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. It stopped. Then came a sound, something tapping on the glass of the bedroom window. One slow tap, then 2 more. I didn't move. My skin crawled. I told myself it could be a branch, but I knew better. I waited. 10 minutes passed. Nothing else came. I didn't sleep again. By the 4th day, I was counting down the hours until I could leave. I regretted coming. The peace I'd wanted felt like isolation now, like a trap. I started noticing small things that weren't right. My firewood pile looked disturbed. Not a lot, but a few pieces had been moved. I know how I stacked them. My backpack, which I kept by the door, had its zippers half open, like someone had looked through it. I hadn't touched it since I arrived. I started locking the door, though I wasn't sure why. There was no one out here. No one was supposed to be out here. I went outside in the late afternoon to double-check the water tank. I had to climb a little hill behind the cabin to get to it. As I was up there, I heard a noise from below, near the porch. I crouched and watched. Someone stepped out from behind a tree. A man, thin, tall, with a long coat, dark pants. He didn't look up at me. He just stood there, facing the cabin. Then he walked up to the porch. Slowly, I stayed frozen. My heart felt like it stopped beating. He reached the door, put his hand on it, tried the knob, then paused, like he was listening. I was too far away to do anything. Couldn't scream. My body wouldn't let me. After a few seconds, he turned and walked back into the trees. No rush, just vanished between the trunks. I stayed on that hill until the sun was almost down. Then I ran inside, locked the door, pushed the table against it. I stayed up all night with a knife in my hand. I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no tapping, but I didn't sleep either. On the 5th day, I left. I packed everything as fast as I could, threw my gear into the car and didn't even bother with trash or cleanup. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't report it. I just drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I hit the paved road. Took a while to shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Even back in town, surrounded by people, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every time I walked past my windows, I expected to see a face there. Took weeks for that feeling to fade. A few months later, I got a message from the site I booked the cabin on. They were asking for a review. I went to the listing thinking I might write something vague, warn people without sounding crazy, but the listing was gone. Deleted. I searched for the cabin by name. Nothing. I looked up the county records to see who owned the land. There was no cabin registered there. That whole section of land hadn't been developed in decades. I double-checked everything. My receipt, my booking confirmation. They were still in my email, but the company's website was gone too. It was like it never existed. And now, sometimes at night, I hear that sound again. 3 slow taps on the glass. But I live on the 2nd floor. My girlfriend and I booked a mountaintop cabin for a quiet weekend away. It was one of those remote places you had to drive up winding gravel roads for nearly an hour to reach. The air got colder as we climbed, and by the time we arrived, it was late afternoon. The place looked nice, basic but clean, with thick wooden walls, a small front porch, and a view that looked out over the valley. No neighbors in sight, just pine trees and silence. Inside, everything was old but well kept. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace and one bedroom. The bathroom was at the back, next to a narrow hallway. I remember noticing one weird thing right away: a small square hatch in the bathroom ceiling. It was maybe 2 feet wide and painted the same color as the ceiling, with a round finger pull in the center. I looked up at it while brushing my teeth. The owner had mentioned it in the message thread before we arrived. Just a quick note saying it was for plumbing access. I didn't think much of it. We unpacked, made some dinner, and spent most of the evening sitting by the fireplace. There was no cell signal and no Wi-Fi, which was part of the appeal. Just the two of us, the fire, and the occasional sound of wind moving through the trees outside. The kind of place where you could actually hear how quiet the world gets when you're far enough away from people. Later that night, after we got into bed, I started hearing something from the bathroom. At first, it was a faint bump. I figured maybe it was the wind or the building settling. It's common with old cabins. But then I heard a second noise, a louder thump, like something hitting the ceiling hard and slow. It wasn't like branches or raccoons. I've heard those before. This was heavier, more deliberate. After the thump came a dragging sound, something scraping softly above the ceiling, moving slowly across. I lay in bed, completely still, trying to make sense of it. The noise went on for a minute, maybe more, and then stopped. I didn't want to wake my girlfriend. I told myself it was probably just animals, or maybe even shifting insulation or water pipes creaking. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I stared at the dark ceiling above me until I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I kept thinking about that hatch. I walked into the bathroom and stared up at it again. It looked harmless enough, just a square cutout with a simple wooden frame. But now, knowing what I'd heard, I couldn't ignore it. We had a foldable step stool in the cabin closet. I brought it into the bathroom and unfolded it under the hatch. I stood there for a second, hesitating, then reached up and pulled the hatch open. A small cloud of dust fell out. The smell hit me right away. Old wood, stale insulation, and something faintly sour, like sweat or old food. I lifted my head up into the opening and turned on my phone flashlight. The space above the ceiling was barely tall enough to crawl through. It was unfinished, just exposed beams, insulation tucked between them, and a thin layer of dust covering everything. But right away, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There were marks in the dust. Long, wide smears, like someone had been crawling around on their stomach or elbows. In between the smears were narrow trails, finger marks, as if someone had been dragging themselves with their hands. I froze for a second, just staring. Then I spotted something else in the far corner of the crawl space. A dark shape, half hidden behind the insulation. I squinted and leaned in a little closer. It was an old, dirty sleeping bag, wadded up like it had been used recently. Next to it was a plastic grocery bag filled with wrappers and a couple of half-eaten protein bars. One of them still had a bite taken out, like it had been left there mid-meal. There were also a couple of crumpled water bottles and something that looked like a small flashlight. I couldn't see much else, but I didn't want to look any further. The space was too small, too dark, and my instincts were screaming at me that I didn't want to know more. I stepped down off the stool and closed the hatch. My heart was pounding. I didn't say anything right away. I just walked out into the living room and sat down, trying to think. I finally told my girlfriend we were leaving. I didn't tell her the whole reason, just said I had a bad feeling and didn't want to stay another night. She trusted me enough not to argue. We packed up everything in less than 20 minutes. Didn't even shower or eat breakfast. Just tossed everything back into the car and started driving down the mountain. The whole way, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to come running out of the woods behind us. When we got back to town and finally had cell signal again, I sent a long email to the cabin owner. I explained what I found, how I'd heard noises, opened the hatch, and discovered what looked like clear evidence that someone had been living up there. I didn't get a response. Not that day, not the next day, not ever. No reply, no apology, no explanation. A few weeks later, I went back to the rental listing out of curiosity. It was gone, taken down entirely. The whole profile was gone too, like it had never existed. No reviews, no listing history. I searched the address online and couldn't find much. just a vague mention in some outdated cabin directory. I thought about reporting it to the police, but I didn't even know what to say. There was no proof anyone had done anything illegal, and it wasn't my property. Still, I think about that place a lot. The smears in the dust, the sleeping bag, the half-eaten protein bars. I keep wondering how long that person had been up there. Were they watching us through vents? Listening to us sleep? Did they leave on their own? Or were they still up there while we packed our bags? I don't stay in remote cabins anymore. I can't relax in them the way I used to. Even in normal houses, I find myself checking closets and ceilings. The idea that someone might be hiding just a few inches above your head, watching, waiting, it gets under your skin in a way nothing else does.